The Echoes of a Lie, Chapter 1, The Ghost in the Frame. Boston, Massachusetts, 2024. Amelia Hayes, a woman meticulously organized by profession and fiercely independent by nature, ran a successful historical preservation firm. Her life was a perfectly cataloged archive. A beautiful brownstone in Beacon Hill, a thriving career, a close circle of friends, and a comfortable, if solitary, existence. Her past, she believed, was a closed book, its pages neatly bound by her mother's steadfast narrative. Her father, Thomas Hayes, a brave firefighter, had died a hero in a tragic warehouse blaze when Amelia was just a baby. He was a silent, revered presence in her life, a portrait on the mantelpiece, a name whispered with reverence, a ghost she had learned to live with, a poignant memory that defined her early loss, but not her current happiness. Her mother, Sarah, now in her late 70s, lived a quiet life in a charming cottage in Marblehead, a short drive up the coast. Their relationship was built on a foundation of profound love and a shared, unspoken grief for the man they had both lost. Sarah was a woman of unwavering strength, her stoic acceptance of tragedy a defining characteristic. She had raised Amelia alone, instilling in her a resilience that had shaped her into the formidable woman she was today. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Amelia was meticulously sorting through boxes of old family photographs at her mother's house, a task Sarah had reluctantly agreed to, claiming she wanted to declutter for future generations, Amelia stumbled upon a small, dusty wooden box tucked away in the back of a rarely opened closet. It felt out of place, almost deliberately hidden. Inside, nestled beneath layers of tissue paper, was a single, unframed photograph. It was an old, faded black and white picture, clearly from the late 1960s or early 70s. It showed a young man, undeniably her father, Thomas Hayes, his familiar smile beaming from the frame. He was standing on a sun-drenched beach, waves lapping at his bare feet, a casual, untamed joy in his eyes. But what sent a jolt of icy dread through Amelia was the figure standing beside him, a young woman, her back mostly to the camera, her arm linked casually through his. She had long, flowing dark hair, a slender build, and a distinctive, almost ethereal grace, and she was heavily pregnant. Amelia's breath hitched. She looked at the woman's swelling belly, then back at her father's joyful face. This wasn't her mother. Her mother, Sarah, had always been petite, with short, practical blonde hair. The woman in the photo was clearly not Sarah. And the pregnancy, her mind reeled. If this woman was pregnant and standing with her father, who was she? And when was this taken? Amelia was born in 1971. The style of the clothes, the carefree vibe, it all pointed to a time just before or around her birth. Could this be her mother before she changed her hair? A fleeting thought she immediately dismissed. This woman was simply not Sarah. A cold, unsettling wave of doubt washed over Amelia, contaminating the pristine archive of her past. Her father, the revered hero, the man who died young, was he with someone else? Was there a secret before her? Or worse, a secret during her parents' marriage? The picture, innocent on the surface, felt like a deliberate crack in the foundation of her entire life. It was a ghost in the frame, hinting at a truth far more complex and potentially far more devastating than the noble, tragic story she had always been told. The perfect, ordered world of Amelia Hayes suddenly felt irrevocably, frighteningly, out of alignment. Chapter 2. The Unraveling Thread. The photograph was a shard of ice in Amelia's carefully curated life. The smiling face of her father, Thomas Hayes, beside a heavily pregnant woman who was undeniably not her mother Sarah, became a relentless torment. The comfortable narrative of her hero father and his tragic early death began to unravel, thread by agonizing thread. Amelia left her mother's house that day with the photograph clutched in her hand, the quiet joy of their afternoon shattered by a single, inexplicable image. She spent the night staring at it, the faces in the frame swimming before her eyes, demanding answers she didn't have. She tried to dismiss it, to rationalize it away. A distant relative? A friend's wife? But the intimacy of the pose, the shared joy in her father's eyes, contradicted every innocent explanation. And the pregnancy, it was undeniably prominent. Her immediate instinct was to confront her mother. But Sarah was fragile, her memory sometimes hazy with age, her heart still carrying the profound weight of Thomas's death. How could Amelia present her with such a potentially devastating image, such a stark contradiction to the life they had built on shared grief? The thought felt cruel, a betrayal of the very love that bound them. Amelia knew she needed more, something concrete, undeniable, before she could risk shattering her mother's peace. She began to meticulously research her father's life, venturing beyond the family anecdotes and the official pronouncements. She searched public records, old newspaper archives, university yearbooks, anything that might shed light on Thomas Hayes, the man, not just the hero. Her mother had always described his life before their marriage as straightforward. A local boy straight out of high school, straight into the fire academy. A steady path. But the photograph hinted at something more. She found old newspaper articles detailing the warehouse fire that had claimed his life in 1972. The reports were consistent. A multi-alarm blaze, a collapsed roof, brave firefighters trapped. Thomas Hayes was among the honored dead, lauded for his bravery. The official story remained intact, but in her deeper dives, Amelia stumbled upon a small, almost insignificant detail in a fire department annual report from 1970, 2 years before Thomas's death. A brief mention of a disciplinary action against Thomas Hayes for unauthorized absence and insubordination during a critical training period. It was a minor infraction, quickly resolved, but it stood out. Her father, the disciplined hero, had seemingly gone AWOL. Why? And where had he been? Could it relate to the woman in the photograph? Amelia, a historian by nature, recognized the patterns of suppressed information, of stories carefully constructed to protect reputations or shield painful truths. The photo, the disciplinary action, they were anomalies, dissonant notes in the otherwise harmonious symphony of her father's official life. She decided to seek out her father's old friends from the fire department, retired veterans who might remember more than the official narratives. She located 2. Frank Moretti, a gruff but kind man in his late 80s, and Robert Mac McMillan, a younger, more jovial man in his early 70s, both living in retirement in Florida. She flew down to Florida, presenting herself as a historian writing a tribute to her father's heroic generation of firefighters. She showed them the standard photos, listened to their fond memories of Thomas, their stories of camaraderie and bravery. Then, carefully, casually, she pulled out the beach photograph. Frank Moretti, initially stoic, stared at the photo, his eyes widening. A flicker of discomfort, then a deeply etched sorrow, crossed his face. He exchanged a quick, knowing glance with Mac. "Well, I'll be," Mac muttered, his jovial demeanor replaced by a solemn quiet. "Haven't seen that picture in decades." "Who is she?" Amelia asked, her voice barely a whisper, her heart pounding. "The woman with my father? And why is she pregnant?" Frank sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He looked at Amelia, his gaze filled with a profound sympathy. Amelia, your father, he had a life before your mother. A different life. A secret life. He began to recount a story that ripped open the carefully stitched seams of Amelia's past. Thomas had been deeply in love with another woman, a free-spirited artist named Eleanor Vance, during a period when he felt suffocated by the expectations of his family and the rigid structure of the fire department. He had met her on a trip to California, a rebellious, unsanctioned journey he took during his unauthorized absence. They had fallen deeply in love, and she became pregnant. They were planning to marry, to start a new life together on the West Coast, away from the constraints of his Bostonian existence. But then, Frank continued, his voice heavy, he got cold feet. Or maybe he just panicked. He was young, scared, and your family, the Hayes family, was very traditional, very influential. They wanted him to follow the path they laid out. They didn't approve of Eleanor, of her lifestyle. They put a lot of pressure on him, and he came back, left her, left them both. He felt immense guilt, Amelia. For years, he never forgot her or the child. Amelia listened, numb with shock. Her father hadn't died a hero who left behind a loving wife and infant daughter. He had been a man with a secret life, a hidden love, and a child he had abandoned. The warehouse fire, the details of his death, suddenly began to twist in her mind, taking on a sinister, disquieting new meaning. The unraveling thread of truth was leading her down a far darker, more treacherous path than she had ever imagined. A path that hinted at a betrayal so profound, it threatened to redefine everything she thought she knew about her family and herself. Chapter 3: The Shadow of the Past. The revelation about Eleanor Vance and the child her father had abandoned sent a seismic shockwave through Amelia's carefully constructed world. The image of the hero, father, martyred in a fiery blaze, crumbled into dust, replaced by the far more complex and troubling figure of a young man caught between duty and desire, ultimately choosing a path that left a trail of heartbreak. The unauthorized absence in his fire department record now screamed of a hidden rebellion, a desperate attempt at a different life. Amelia's conversation with Frank Moretti and Mac McMillan, while providing crucial answers, left her with a searing question. If her father had abandoned Eleanor Vance and their child, why had her mother, Sarah, never mentioned it? Did Sarah know? Or was she, too, a victim of Thomas's secret, marrying a man who carried a hidden past? The very foundation of her family, the narrative of their shared grief, now felt like a carefully constructed facade, concealing a far more painful, complex truth. Back in Boston, Amelia delved deeper, this time focusing on Eleanor Vance. The name sparked a faint, unsettling familiarity, a whisper from a distant corner of her mind that she couldn't quite place. She scoured online archives, historical records, anything that might reveal what became of Eleanor. It was a painstaking task, made harder by the passage of time and the commonness of the name. She discovered Eleanor had been an artist, a free spirit who dabbled in experimental art in California in the late 1960s. Amelia found mentions of her in obscure arts journals and exhibition catalogs from that period, always described as enigmatic and intensely private. There were no public records of a marriage, no obituaries. Eleanor Vance, like a phantom, had seemingly vanished. The warehouse fire, the official account of her father's death, had always been so clear, so straightforward. But now, tinged with the knowledge of his secret life and his abandonment of another child. The circumstances of his death felt incomplete. Amelia, a historical preservationist, knew that official narratives often simplified messy realities. She found herself revisiting the old newspaper reports, meticulously scanning for any overlooked detail, any subtle discrepancy. Then, a chilling coincidence. She discovered that a few months after her father's reported death in the 1972 warehouse fire, the very warehouse that had supposedly claimed his life, a prominent art gallery in downtown Boston that had previously showcased Eleanor Vance's work, also mysteriously burned down. The fire was ruled accidental, attributed to faulty wiring, and the case was closed. Amelia remembered fleeting whispers about it from her childhood, dismissed as tragic but unrelated events. Now the proximity, the connection to Eleanor, sent a shiver down her spine. Coincidence or something more sinister? The thought at first was a mere flicker, quickly dismissed as the product of an overactive, traumatized imagination. But it persisted. What if? What if her father hadn't died in that warehouse fire? What if he had used it as an elaborate, desperate escape, a way to vanish from his double life, from the expectations of his family, from the guilt of abandoning Eleanor and their child? The idea was outrageous, almost unbelievable, but the pieces of the puzzle, once scattered and seemingly unrelated, were beginning to align in a terrifying, coherent pattern. A hidden love, the disciplinary action, a secret child, a conveniently timed fire at a gallery linked to Eleanor Vance and her subsequent disappearance. Amelia felt a profound sense of isolation. She couldn't tell her mother, not yet. The pain, the betrayal, might be too much. Her friends, while supportive, couldn't comprehend the seismic shift in her reality. She was alone, navigating a treacherous landscape of deception and unspoken truths. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Amelia decided to visit the site of the warehouse fire. The old building had been demolished decades ago, replaced by a gleaming modern office complex. But the ground, she believed, held echoes. As she stood on the busy city sidewalk, staring at the glass facade of the new building, she closed her eyes, trying to imagine the roaring flames, the chaos, the desperate heroism. And then a new memory, unbidden, terrifying, flashed through her mind. Not a dream, but a searing, visceral image. A child's hand, small and reaching, held firmly in a large, strong hand. A firefighter's glove, not Thomas's official uniform glove, but a different, dark, unfamiliar glove. And the child's hand, unmistakably her own, pulling away, a muffled cry, a sensation of being left behind. And the distant sound of sirens, growing fainter. Amelia gasped, her eyes snapping open. She wasn't just remembering the fire. She was remembering being there, as a child, not as a baby at home. Safe with her mother, mourning her father's death, but at the scene, and being separated from someone. From him, her father, Thomas. The terrifying conclusion hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her father hadn't died. He had been there, alive, and he had deliberately left her. Not abandoned her as a baby with Eleanor Vance, but abandoned her at the scene of his own faked death. The ghost in the frame was not a symbol of tragedy, but of a calculated, devastating betrayal. The shadow of the past was not just a memory. It was a living, breathing presence, and it was demanding to be acknowledged, to be confronted. Chapter 4. The Unmasking. The revelation that her father might have faked his death, abandoning her at the scene, sent Amelia into a tailspin of emotional turmoil. The cherished narrative of the hero firefighter, a pillar of her identity, shattered into a million painful pieces. The very foundation of her life, built on that noble lie, felt like shifting sand. The memory of the child's hand, undeniably her own, pulling away from a firefighter's glove, the fading sirens, it was too vivid, too visceral to dismiss. She knew she couldn't confront her mother, Sarah, with this shattering possibility. The truth, if it proved to be true, would not only invalidate Sarah's entire life of grief, but also expose her to a deeper, far more painful betrayal. Amelia had to confirm it, beyond a shadow of a doubt, before anything else. Her first step was to scrutinize the original fire department records, not just the newspaper clippings. She used her professional connections, her expertise in historical preservation, to gain access to the archives. She wasn't looking for discrepancies in the official account of the blaze, but for anomalies in Thomas Hayes's personal records. She found them, a subtle, almost imperceptible detail in the personnel file. A life insurance policy, unusually large, with the beneficiary listed as Sarah Hayes and minor dependent Amelia Hayes. The payout was swift, unusually so for such a complex tragedy. And then, a small, almost hidden note, an internal memo from the fire chief to the commissioner, heavily redacted, but containing a chilling phrase. Circumstances of Hayes's remains highly unusual, insufficient for definitive identification. Family wishes for closure. Family wishes for closure. Was that a polite way of saying they didn't push for a complete investigation? That they accepted the narrative without question? Or worse, that they were complicit? The pieces began to fall into place with terrifying clarity. A man desperate to escape a double life, a faked death made plausible by the chaos of a large fire, a quick insurance payout, a family eager for closure, perhaps unknowingly covering for his disappearance, and a small child, Amelia, left behind in the confusion. Amelia then remembered her father's old friends, Frank Moretti and Mac McMillan. She had already confirmed with them the existence of Eleanor Vance and the secret child. Now she needed to push them further. She called Frank first, her voice carefully modulated, betraying none of the tremor she felt inside. "Frank," she began, "I've been going through some old fire department records. There's a curious note about my father's remains, insufficient for definitive identification." What did that mean, really? There was a long silence on the other end of the line, a silence heavy with unspoken secrets. Frank sighed, a deep, weary sound. "Amelia, your father was a good man, but he was complicated. He was in too deep, with Eleanor, with that other life. He felt trapped. He wanted out, completely out." He revealed a shocking truth. Thomas Hayes had orchestrated his own death in the warehouse fire. He had been suffering immense guilt over abandoning Eleanor Vance and their child, coupled with the suffocating expectations of his official life with Sarah. He confessed to Frank in a drunken, desperate night shortly before the fire that he wished he could just disappear, start fresh. The warehouse fire, a massive, chaotic event, presented him with an opportunity. He used his knowledge of the building's layout, his access to equipment, to stage his disappearance, making it appear he was trapped in the collapse, leaving just enough remains to satisfy the official report. but not enough for definitive identification. "He never meant for you to be there, Amelia," Frank said, his voice thick with sorrow. "He thought you were safe at home with Sarah. It was a mistake, a terrible, tragic mistake. He saw you there after it was too late. He saw you with another firefighter. He panicked. He couldn't risk exposing himself. He just disappeared." Amelia hung up the phone, her hand trembling. The unmasking was complete. Her father was alive. He had chosen to disappear, to abandon her, not once, but twice. The noble hero was a ghost, replaced by a man who had made unimaginable choices to escape his own life. The betrayal was raw, a searing wound in her soul. Her next step was to confirm this living ghost. She turned to Sarah Jenkins, the private investigator who had so deftly helped her in the past. "Sarah," Amelia said, her voice strained but resolute, "I need you to find Thomas Hayes, my father. I believe he's alive." Sarah, professional as ever, listened to the incredible, painful story, her face betraying no judgment, only a quiet determination. Tracing someone who deliberately vanished decades ago would be incredibly difficult, but not impossible. They used the old details of Eleanor Vance, David Shaw, the man Kate loved, and the hints of radical circles. Thomas Hayes, if he had truly disappeared, would have likely sought a life far from his past, perhaps even connecting with the counterculture networks that Eleanor Vance had been part of. The search was extensive, frustrating, but Sarah's expertise was unparalleled. Years of sifting through old, obscure records, of cross-referencing names and dates, of chasing down fleeting leads, finally paid off. They found him, living quietly under an assumed name, in a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains of North Carolina. A reclusive man living off the grid, a ghost who had chosen to remain unseen for over 5 decades. He was now in his early 80s. Amelia stared at the grainy photograph Sarah sent her. An old man, his face etched with age and solitude, but the eyes, the smile lines, undeniably her father. He was alive, and he wanted to see her. The final, crushing blow. After a lifetime of believing him dead, of revering his sacrifice, he was alive, and now, after all these years, he wanted to see the daughter he had twice abandoned. The unmasking was complete, but the reckoning, the confrontation with the living ghost of her past, was yet to come. Chapter 5. The Appalachian Echo. The photograph of the old man in the remote Appalachian cabin, undeniably her father, Thomas Hayes, living under an assumed name, sent Amelia into a vortex of conflicting emotions. Relief that he was alive tangled with a searing anger at his lifelong deception, his multiple abandonments. The hero she had mourned, the ghost she had revered, was a living man who had chosen to vanish, leaving a trail of fabricated grief and unanswered questions in his wake. He was alive, and he wanted to see her. This invitation, delivered through Sarah Jenkins, the private investigator, felt less like an olive branch and more like a challenge. After 5 decades of silence, of believing him dead, how could he possibly expect her to simply appear? The very audacity of it fueled her rage, yet a deeper, primal curiosity tugged at her. She had to understand. She had to hear his side of the story, however painful it might be. Amelia flew to North Carolina, Sarah accompanying her, providing a professional and emotional buffer. The drive into the mountains was long and winding, the landscape growing wilder, more remote with every mile. The world Thomas Hayes had chosen was one of isolation, a deliberate retreat from the life he had once inhabited. They found the cabin nestled deep in the woods, a simple, rustic structure shrouded by ancient trees. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a domestic touch that felt unsettlingly incongruous with the man who lived within. As they approached, the door opened. An old man stood in the doorway, his frame still tall, though stooped by age. His hair was white, his face deeply lined, but his eyes, a startling blue, held a familiar intensity. It was him, Thomas Hayes, her father, the ghost made flesh. He looked at Amelia, his gaze lingering, searching. A profound sorrow etched itself onto his face, followed by a flicker of disbelief, then a fragile, almost painful hope. He held out a trembling hand, not reaching for her, but offering a silent plea. "Amelia," he rasped, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. "You came." Amelia, her heart a tangled knot of anger, sorrow, and an undeniable flicker of longing, simply nodded. She couldn't speak. The weight of 50 years of absence, of deception, pressed down on her. They sat on his small, rickety porch swing, the silence punctuated only by the chirping of crickets and the rustle of leaves. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a lifetime of regret. "I know there's nothing I can say, nothing I can do to make up for what I did, for the choices I made, for the pain I caused." He began to tell his story, his voice gaining strength as he unburdened himself of decades of silence. He recounted his passionate, consuming love for Eleanor Vance, their dream of a free, unburdened life in California, the profound shock and fear when she became pregnant, his sudden, overwhelming panic at the thought of abandoning his family, his career, his entire known existence, for a life that was exhilarating but terrifyingly uncertain. "I was a coward, Amelia," he admitted, his voice raw with self-reproach. "A complete coward. I chose the path of least resistance. I came back to Boston, broke it off with Eleanor, leaving her and our child. The guilt was immense. It ate at me. I tried to bury it, to live the life I was supposed to have." He spoke of his marriage to Sarah, a kind, good woman whom he respected and genuinely cared for. But he admitted with painful honesty that a part of him had always yearned for the life he had forsaken, the freedom he had glimpsed with Eleanor. The guilt compounded, becoming an unbearable weight. Then came the warehouse fire, a chaotic, multi-alarm blaze. A chance. "It was an impulse, Amelia," he said, his voice strained. "A desperate, split-second decision. The building was collapsing, smoke everywhere. I saw my opportunity. I made it look like I was trapped. I disappeared into the chaos. I never looked back." Amelia listened, her anger warring with a strange, almost sickening understanding. He wasn't a malicious monster. He was a deeply flawed, terrified young man who had made a series of catastrophic choices. But the betrayal was still raw. "And me?" Amelia's voice was a harsh whisper. "You left me there, at the scene of your own fake death. How could you?" His eyes filled with fresh tears, the first genuine tears Amelia had seen him shed. "That was the biggest regret, the most profound agony of my life, Amelia. I thought you were safe at home. I truly did. I had no idea Sarah would bring you to the scene, to wait for me, to show support. I saw you just for a moment in the chaos, with another firefighter, pulling you away from the perimeter. My heart stopped, but I was already committed. I couldn't risk revealing myself. I had to go, to disappear. Leaving you there, it haunted me every single day, every night." He spoke of a life lived in solitude, under a new name, constantly looking over his shoulder, always aware of the past he had severed. He had worked odd jobs, lived simply. His only companion, the immense silence and the gnawing guilt. He had read about Sarah and Amelia in old newspaper clippings, watched from afar, seeing Amelia grow into a successful, beautiful woman. He had followed her career, her achievements, always at a distance, a silent, unseen specter. "I wanted to reach out so many times," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "But what could I say? What right did I have? I was a coward. I ran. I just existed." He confessed that his failing health, the creeping shadows of mortality, had finally forced his hand. He wanted to confess, to unburden his soul, to seek forgiveness, even if he didn't deserve it. He wanted to see her, just once, to tell her the truth before it was too late. The air between them was thick with unaddressed pain, with decades of silence finally broken. The Appalachian echo, the voice of her living ghost father, had spoken. And the truth, raw and brutal, was finally out. The reckoning was far from over. The immense task of processing, of understanding, and ultimately of choosing lay before Amelia. Forgiveness, she knew, was a long and treacherous road. Chapter 6: The Long Road to Reconciliation. The raw truth, unburdened by her father, Thomas Hayes, in his remote Appalachian cabin, left Amelia reeling. He was not the hero she had mourned, nor the monster she sometimes imagined. He was a deeply flawed man, broken by fear and guilt, who had made a series of desperate, heartbreaking choices. The confession was a torrent of pain and regret, but also a fragile beginning. Amelia spent several days in the mountains, speaking with her father. Each conversation was a slow, agonizing unraveling of a lifetime of secrets. He showed her faded photographs of Eleanor Vance, of the small cabin they shared in California, of sketches Eleanor had made of him. He painted a picture of a desperate love, a yearning for freedom, a life that had been brutally cut short by his own fear and societal pressure. He also spoke of the profound, constant guilt he felt for Sarah, for the life he had forced her to live, and for the deception he had maintained. He asked about Sarah, about her life, about Amelia's children. He listened intently, tears often in his eyes, mourning the decades he had missed, the lives he had walked away from. He longed to know about his grandchildren, the lives that had sprung from the branches he had severed. Amelia, cautiously, showed him photographs of her adult children, of her life in Boston. He studied them with a quiet, profound sorrow, a silent acknowledgement of his absence. The scar on Amelia's arm, a physical manifestation of her own secret history, was a testament to the complex legacy of her parents, both biological and adoptive. It was a visible reminder of the painful choices made by Kate Miller, her biological mother, and the profound love that had led to her adoption by the Ashtons. Now, it also echoed the deliberate choices of Thomas Hayes, her biological father, a symbol of the rupture and the fragile mending. Amelia returned to Boston, her mind a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The burden of the secret was now hers to bear. She couldn't keep this from her mother Sarah any longer. The truth, however painful, had to come out. Sarah deserved to know the full story of the man she had loved, the grief she had carried, the life she had built on a foundation of a profound, devastating lie. The conversation with Sarah was excruciating. Amelia chose a quiet evening when her mother was relaxed, settled in her favorite armchair. She began cautiously, referencing the initial photograph she had found, the one of Thomas and the pregnant woman. She then gently, patiently recounted everything: Eleanor Vance, the secret child, the disciplinary action, the coincidence of the gallery fire, and finally, Thomas's confession in the mountains. Sarah listened, her face pale, her hands trembling. Her initial reaction was shock, then a profound, almost primal wail of betrayal. 50 years of grief, of loyalty, of a life lived in memory of a lost hero, shattered in an instant. Tears streamed down her face, tears of sorrow, of anger, of a terrible, unbidden understanding. "He was alive?" Sarah whispered, her voice raw, her eyes wide with disbelief. "All this time? And he just left us?" Amelia held her mother, offering comfort, explaining Thomas's immense guilt, his cowardice, his desperate need to escape a life he felt trapped in. She spoke of his regret, his solitude, his failing health, his final wish for forgiveness. It was not an excuse, but an attempt at context, at understanding the complex, tragic choices of a man caught in a web of his own making. Sarah's anger slowly, painfully began to subside, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. The rage exhausted her, leaving only the profound ache of a life lived under a lie. She looked at Amelia, her eyes filled with a new, complex understanding. "He loved you, Amelia," she said, her voice softer, "in his own way, and I loved him. And I loved you more than anything." The two women, mother and daughter, wept together, not just for Thomas, but for the years of unspoken truth, for the lives shaped by secrets and tragic choices. It was a long, painful road to reconciliation. But they walked it together, their bond strengthened by the shared burden and the ultimate release of truth. Amelia also had to consider her own children. They had grown up with the story of their heroic grandfather, the firefighter. How much should she tell them? She decided on an honest, age-appropriate version, explaining that sometimes life is complicated and people make difficult choices, but that love, in its many forms, endures. She emphasized that their grandfather, Thomas, had loved her, even in his flawed, distant way, and that their grandmother, Sarah, had loved them all fiercely and unconditionally. The scar on Amelia's arm, once a source of deep personal distress, became a quiet symbol of her journey. It was no longer just a physical mark, but a testament to resilience, to the complex tapestry of identity, to the power of forgiveness. She continued her work in historical preservation, now with a deeper, more nuanced understanding of the hidden layers of history, of the unspoken stories that lie beneath official narratives. She eventually returned to the Appalachian cabin, not for anger, but for understanding. She found a fragile peace with her father, recognizing his profound regret and the immense burden he had carried. Their relationship was not one of easy affection, but of quiet, difficult acceptance. She learned to forgive, not for his sake, but for her own, to release the bitterness that had taken root in her heart. The echoes of a lie had finally faded, replaced by the symphony of a complete, though imperfect, truth. Amelia Hayes, a woman who meticulously organized history, had finally brought order to her own, allowing her to step fully into a future unburdened by ghosts and secrets, a future built on the foundation of a hard-won, profound reconciliation.